Hello and welcome to The Broken Sword. Today we are looking at the inspiration behind Tolkien's works.
Build me a home worthy of Mordor.
Today's video is brought to you by Lord of Maps. Stay tuned until further into the video to discover our unique promo code for a great discount so that you can own your own incredible map. An old wandering wizard. A golden ring with magical powers that could reshape the world. A powerful dragon with a voracious appetite for gold. When you hear these things, what's the first thought that comes to your mind? Even if you're not a massive Tolkien fan, you could probably figure out the similarities between these descriptions and Norse mythology. So, I feel it is worth a dive into looking at this deeper today. Odin, like Gandalf, was often depicted as an old cloaked sorcerer wandering through the woods. And Sauron's mastery of ringcraft can be sourced to the ancient ring of ALBERICH, the dwarf, which, in some depictions, granted its bearer power to rule the world. Even the dragon SMAUG owes much of his likeness to the legendary Norse foe FAFNIR the dragon, or the dragon that hoarded gold in Beowulf's poem. But, like many other readers, you might be tempted to think these similarities are only surface deep, that they are just a handful of small, whimsical symbols and homages that Tolkien sampled, while the vast majority of his work was more greatly inspired by other myths. But you may be wrong with that. The Norse influence on the shaping of Middle-earth and the cultures therein is far deeper than that. So with this, we're going to dive through the symbolism of Tolkien's work and the histories of the people within Arda. And with that, we will find out the truth about Norse myths and Middle-earth. So firstly, to decide how much of Tolkien's work is influenced by Norse myths or not, you might be wondering, what exactly did Tolkien base the world of Arda on? And the answer to that is fairly simple. For the most part, all the tales that Tolkien created, from his unfinished sequel to The Lord of the Rings, to his revised scraps of Lioudmila that were included in the history of Middle-earth, these were meant to be an actual fictional prehistory of our own world, meaning the world, its gods, and events are analogues with ones in our own history, and that may even shock some of the more casual readers. After all, one of Tolkien's most famous quotes proudly objects to drawing parallels between the story of The Lord of the Rings and the events that unfolded during the Second World War. But if you dig only a little bit deeper and look at some of Tolkien's letters, you'll see that he created all of his tales as a sort of fictional retelling of our real Earth's history, and rather envious that other cultures like the Greeks or the Egyptians had such an amazing complex lore themselves. So Tolkien decided that his prehistory would be a stand-in for England's own lack of mythology. Now, let's just quickly pause the video here so I can talk about our sponsor for today's video. If you are into Tolkien, then I'm sure you can appreciate a high-quality hand-drawn map, while in which case there is only one place to look, and that is with Lord of Maps. As they say, you can almost smell the crisp air passing over thick forests and towering mountains. And that is no understatement. So wouldn't you want to be like Bilbo and pore over maps of the countries that you've either visited or wish to visit in the future? Well, this is just the way to do it. And thankfully, they've given us an amazing promo code to give to you all, which is The Broken Heart. And that is for a special 15% off discount for Valentine's Day. Just think of what a special, unique, and personal gift that could make. However, now, let's get back to the inspirations of Tolkien by jumping into some of the words from the man himself. Do not laugh, but once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendour from the vast black cloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. But there was a problem. The very reason that Tolkien was motivated to create these legends for England was the very thing that drew him to use Norse myths for his inspiration. Most of the ancient myths of Anglo-Saxon England were gone. They were never recorded in great quantity, but those that were struggled to survive through the endless invasions, raids, and wars that the island had faced. And that meant, when it came to write the tales of Middle-earth, besides looking at the likes of Christianity and the Roman myths, Tolkien looked to the sagas of Scandinavia, which means place names and people names. So let us look at these names. After all, that is how Tolkien started his stories, as he famously said, "The invention of languages is the foundation. The stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse. To me, a name comes first, and the story follows." You might know this already, but most of the dwarf names from The Hobbit were first stripped from the pages of the Poetic Edda, a collection of stories that retold the ancient myths of early Norse peoples. Balin, Biffa, Bofa, Bomba, Dwalin, Fili, Gloin, Kili, all of these and more were first featured in the ancient Icelandic texts, and it's actually among that list of dwarfs that we can find one of the 7 dwarf fathers, Durin. If names come first by Tolkien's own admission, then how much of Middle-earth's culture is owed to the Poetic Edda? It is likely more than we could know, but we will continue to talk about that in a bit. Now, before we go too much further, there is one more very important name that we should mention, and that is Gandalf. Gandalf was the name of a dwarf in the original Norse texts. If we look at the word's etymology, we'll see that it comes from the Old Norse term for wand, Gandr, and the word for elf, Alfr. So together, the combination of the two terms implies that Gandalf was a wizard or conjurer of some sort, a very likely reason that Tolkien used the name to begin with. With these names and the names of his own creation, Tolkien only needed to create a story now, and that's where the professor really started to let his Norse influences run freely. If we begin with Gandalf, and the way that the character was portrayed, you can clearly see a connection to a famous Norse myth, Odin. At times Tolkien called Gandalf an angel, or a wise old wizard like Merlin, but more often than not, he couldn't avoid the apt comparison to Odin. In many tales, this king of the Norse gods would wander the world in search of knowledge. Eventually he would even lose one of his eyes in the pursuit. As a member of the Istari, Gandalf suffered from the same desire, tasked with helping the people of Middle-earth defend themselves against Sauron, and also investigating exactly what the enemy was up to. Gandalf found himself travelling thousands of kilometres through stone-paved paths and woodland trails, always in search of knowledge. But more than Gandalf, it's the Ring of Power that seems to draw the most comparisons to Norse myths. Tales about rings of power exist in almost every culture throughout the world, so this is nothing unique. The ancient Greeks told tales of powerful rings that could grant the bearers invisibility, much like the One Ring made Bilbo and Frodo undetectable to the human eye, putting them into the Wraith world. Even the ancient Hebrews recited stories of their kings and the rings that bestowed great wisdom or supernatural powers to them, like the one that Solomon wore on his hands. But the rings of the Norse sagas were different. They were evil, or at least they were cursed. The most famous was the ring that Sigurd discovered after killing the gold-hoarding dragon Fafnir. That ring, known as Andvaranort, could trace its lineage all the way back to a mythical dwarf who it was named after, Andvari. Some legends claim the dwarf forged it himself, while others simply say he was the owner. Unlike the One Ring, the Andvaranort didn't simply give its bearer the ability to control the will of other races. Instead, its power was much more conventional. It could create more gold. But wealth, especially in the Norse world, was simply a vehicle for amassing power. And the gods grew jealous of Andvari, especially the god Loki, who decided he must steal this ring. This story was retold and refashioned several times over and through the centuries. In the 1300s, the legend resurfaced as the Volsunga saga, and it was drawn out into a far longer epic. Much of it remained the same, including the allure of the powerful ring and that Andvari had created it. In the Volsunga saga, when Andvari was coerced into giving up the ring to Loki, he cursed it, so that all of its future bearers' lives would be filled with tragedy. The power of the ring, its ability to grant power and wealth to its owner, it was ultimately a temptation too difficult to resist. Time after time, Scandinavian heroes killed each other to get their hands on that ring, and time after time, the cursed Anvaranort only ruined their lives. Within this same saga, Odin appears, wandering the world beneath a traveller's cloak, imparting wisdom or helping out in battles at the nick of time. Seemingly more like the inspiration for the Gandalf we know in this depiction more than any other. While J.R.R. Tolkien was famously proud of Beowulf as the most traditional Old English text to survive through the millennia, he was sad to admit that even this tale wasn't native to England. And this is since Beowulf and his fellow characters resided in northern Germanic tribes that lived on the southern shores of Sweden and Denmark. These, too, can be claimed as Norse in origin. Many of the Old English names present in Beowulf would be borrowed for creatures and locations in Tolkien's Middle-earth. Ents, Orcs, Elves, all of these appeared first in Beowulf, before Tolkien assigned them a home in his own lore. Besides the names, which were admittedly Old English, although that language was actually Germanic, in a sense Norse too, the actual characters of these Scandinavian myths ended up inspiring many of the creatures that populated Middle-earth. Gollum, for one, is unmistakably inspired by Grendel. A pale-skinned monster lurking in the depths of the Misty Mountain is an obvious homage to the terrible monster that devoured the men in King Hrothgar's halls. Perhaps Grendel was also the inspiration for the trolls that Melkor first created in the Years of the Trees. And while the dragon Fafnir, who hoarded over a treasure trove in the Volsunga saga, must have certainly served as a template for Smaug, the dragon in Beowulf is eerily more similar. Smaug and Beowulf's flying worm both attacked in the stillness of night, craved revenge whenever their precious gold was stolen, and lived in archaic stone dungeons. Just as Tolkien borrowed names for his dwarves from the Poetic Edda, the professor couldn't help but pluck the very best words from Beowulf for The Lord of the Rings. Many of these were applied to the kingdom of Rohan. The most obvious is Hammer. In Old Norse, he went by Hymir, and he was a frequently occurring character in the Germanic sagas. EOMER as well was originally a nobleman in the epic poem, whose name Tolkien found irresistible. But it's more than just names. If we look closely at the Kingdom of Rohan, we can see its political structures and society are drenched in Norse culture. And when we expand past Rohan and see the ways in which that kingdom of Horse Lords shares common heritage with Gondor and Arnor through the Atar-Natari, and that's where we find the deepest connection between the Norse and Tolkien's worlds. Ruled by a king, Theoden, who lived in a great hall, Meduseld, the government of Rohan was very much in line with the methods that the ancient Norse used. In fact, the Danish king Hrothgar, who Beowulf journeys to help in the poem, owned a massive Viking mead hall called Heorot, which inspired Theoden's own keep. And there's more. Now, admittedly, these comparisons might seem smaller, but they reveal the depths in which Tolkien knowingly infused his world with Norse culture. After all, it is always the small details in Tolkien's work that reveal just how deep the lore goes. When it comes to Theoden, you rarely see people address him as King Theoden, with the title of King first and his name second. More often than not, the citizens of the Mark said Theoden King. This wasn't simply a cute way of giving the people of Rohan a unique dialect. No, this is actually how the Norse used to address their own leaders. They would say their names first and then their titles afterwards. And if we look at the role of women in Norse society, specifically now when we compare it to Eowyn, we'll find something quite interesting. Eowyn is described as a shield maiden, and unlike other women in The Lord of the Rings, goes on to become a mighty warrior. That idea can be found in the Valkyrie of the Norse, and even in the actual Ring saga that we mentioned earlier in the form of Brunhilde. Even in the afterlife, the kingdom of Rohan shared customs with the ancient Norse. Their burial mounds that were filled with the remains of their kings were perhaps taken from the traditions of the earliest Vikings. The ritualistic funerals and the feasting seem very much in line with Tolkien's own love of Beowulf and King Hrothgar's hall. In all fairness, a lot of different cultures around the world buried their dead in mounds, but we have to look at the comparison between Rohan and the Geats of Beowulf from a larger picture, and we can see how much of their culture is represented in the Riders of the Mark. So now, as we finish up here, I want to remind you of one thing. Tolkien was inspired by a lot of different things, and perhaps first and foremost, he conceived of his work as a thoroughly Catholic piece of literature. But his love of ancient Norse sagas is obvious to see, and each of those myths, from the ancient ring cycle to the mead halls of Hrothgar, these helped shape the books that we love so much, and they certainly wouldn't have been the same without it. And now, quickly before we round things up, I want to remind you all of Lord of Maps. These guys have been amazing to sponsor this video for today, and honestly, their products are just incredible. I swear, I am not just saying that. They are 100% worth checking out if you love the look of hand-drawn world maps. After all, who wouldn't love one of these for their own country? So remember, use that discount code, The Broken Heart, and get your 15% off for the Valentine's special sale. Because the idea of this as a special Valentine's Day treat for that special person just makes everything that little bit more personal. So remember guys, check out Lord of Maps. And so, there we have it, a breakdown of how Norse legends influenced the writings of Tolkien. It is very interesting to see just how so many names and words that are generally associated specifically with Tolkien have far older roots. After all, it is almost impossible to be 100% original anymore. You will always find inspiration from something that came before you, but that does not take a single thing away from anything that he did. I want to really emphasize that this is really not a way of trying to out Tolkien and make him seem not as special as he was. Tolkien, in my opinion, is debatably the greatest writer to have ever lived, and the fact he took things from Norse mythology in the way he did, I don't think hinders that at all. It does just also show that there are still many other great tales, myths, legends, and stories out there if you feel any might be worth checking out. So hopefully you did enjoy this video in having a look at what inspired him. So like I said, I hope you all enjoyed this video for today, but this now leads me onto my question for today, and that is, what is your favourite of the Norse legends? Do you have one or two that you really love and have always known about? Or perhaps you know nothing of Norse mythology at all, and perhaps after this video you may want to go and check them out. Please let me know all of your thoughts and opinions on this in the comment section below. And also now to firstly quickly mention our other channels, links of course will be in the description below if you would like to check them out. And of course we have to shout out our patrons. Firstly, we have our Divine Power tier members of Kevin, Abram and Matt. You are all just incredible. And a big thank you to our Fire Demon tier members of Nashith, Denversteel and Gregory. You are awesome. And as well, I cannot forget the Wizard Staff tier members of John, Andrew and Finrod Felagund. Every single one of you is a true legend of the Brohirrim. So finally, if you have managed to reach the very end of this video with me today, I really hope you have enjoyed what you've seen. And if you have, please hit that subscribe button if you have not already, hit the bell icon too, so that you could be notified of all of our future uploads, and why not drop a like on the video while you're doing all of that. So, thank you if you have managed to reach the very end of this video with me today. Another big thank you to Lord of Maps, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.